The auctioneer's gavel came down like a judge's sentence, and with 3 sharp cracks of wood against wood, the Victorian mansion that had stood on Maple Ridge for 127 years was sold for $500 to a woman the entire town had written off as crazy. Sarah Mitchell stood in the back of the courthouse steps, her threadbare coat pulled tight against the November wind, while her sister's family laughed so hard that Patricia actually had to lean against her husband for support. $500 for a mansion. $500 for a rotting pile of wood and broken dreams that nobody in their right mind would touch with a 10-foot pole. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah's hands shook as she signed the purchase documents, not from cold but from the crushing weight of what she'd just done. The bank account she'd scraped together over 6 years of working double shifts at Miller's Diner now held exactly $73.18. The Victorian mansion, officially named Blackwood Estate in the county records, came with 4 acres of overgrown land, a collapsed carriage house, and a property tax bill that was 3 years overdue. Her brother-in-law Marcus made sure everyone within earshot could hear his commentary. Only Sarah would be stupid enough to buy that death trap. Remember when old Vernon Blackwood died in there? They didn't find his body for 2 weeks. The whole place probably still smells like a corpse. Patricia, Sarah's older sister by 11 years, shook her head with the kind of pity usually reserved for stray dogs with 3 legs. Sarah honey, it's not too late to back out. You could get your money back, move into that nice apartment complex on River Street. They have a pool and everything. But Sarah just kept signing papers, her pen moving across lines that felt like they were sealing her fate rather than securing her future. She'd heard every argument already, listened to 2 months of family interventions where everyone from her mother to her aunt's neighbor had tried to talk sense into her. The Blackwood Estate was a local legend for all the wrong reasons. Built in 1896 by timber baron Edmund Blackwood, the 3-story Victorian had been the crown jewel of Maple Ridge when the logging industry was booming and money flowed through the mountain town like spring runoff. But Edmund had lost everything in the market crash of 1929, and the mansion had passed through 7 different owners in the decades that followed, each one driven away by maintenance costs that exceeded any reasonable person's budget. The current disaster had started 3 years ago when Vernon Blackwood, the last surviving member of the original family, had died alone in the master bedroom at age 92. Vernon had been a recluse for the final 20 years of his life, letting the property decay around him while he lived on a pension that barely covered groceries. By the time social services had discovered his body, the mansion was already falling apart. The roof leaked in 17 places, the plumbing was shot, the electrical system was a fire hazard, and the foundation had settled so unevenly that doors no longer closed properly and floors sloped at angles that made visitors dizzy. The county had seized the property for unpaid taxes and had been trying to sell it ever since, but even at auction with a starting bid of $5,000, nobody had been willing to take on the financial black hole that Blackwood Estate represented. Nobody except Sarah Mitchell, 34 years old, divorced, childless, and according to her family's increasingly vocal opinion, suffering from some kind of mental breakdown that required professional intervention. Sarah had tried explaining her reasoning, but words like potential and investment opportunity and historical value just made her family laugh harder. They saw a condemned building that would cost hundreds of thousands to restore. Sarah saw something different, though she couldn't quite articulate what that something was. Maybe it was the photographs she'd found in the local library, images of the Blackwood Estate in its glory days when the wraparound porch had been pristine white and the tower windows had gleamed like jewels in the mountain sunlight. Maybe it was the architect's original drawings that showed the mansion's bones, the solid timber frame and intricate craftsmanship that you couldn't find in modern construction. Or maybe it was just the desperate need to own something, anything, that couldn't be taken away by a man who decided after 8 years of marriage that he'd rather start over with his 26-year-old dental hygienist. The divorce had been finalized 14 months ago, and Sarah had walked away with almost nothing. Derek had been the primary earner as a commercial real estate developer, and his lawyer had been significantly better than the public defender Sarah had barely been able to afford. The house they'd bought together went to Derek. The car went to Derek. Even the dog went to Derek, though Max had been Sarah's birthday present and had slept at the foot of her side of the bed every night for 5 years. Sarah had left the courthouse with her clothes, her grandmother's wedding ring, and a settlement check for $12,000 that was supposed to represent her share of 8 years of marriage and partnership. She'd moved into her mother's basement, worked 2 jobs to avoid spending her settlement money, and spent every free moment researching property auctions and real estate opportunities that someone with limited resources might actually be able to afford. The Blackwood Estate auction had appeared in the county notices 3 months ago, and Sarah had become obsessed. She'd visited the property 6 times, climbing through broken windows to explore rooms that hadn't been occupied in years, taking measurements and photographs and detailed notes about what would need to be repaired or replaced. Every visit had revealed new problems. Water damage that had rotted through subflooring, a chimney that was separating from the main structure, windows so old that the glass had started to flow like liquid, creating wavy distortions that made the outside world look like something from a fever dream. But every visit had also revealed unexpected beauty. Hand-carved woodwork that showed the skill of craftsmen who no longer existed. Original stained glass windows hidden behind boards that featured designs of local wildflowers and mountain landscapes. Hardwood floors underneath decades of grime that were solid oak, 3 inches thick, the kind of quality that modern builders couldn't afford to install even if they wanted to. Sarah had run the numbers 24 times, calculating costs and timelines and realistic outcomes. The math never worked. Even if she did 90% of the restoration work herself, even if she managed to learn plumbing and electrical work and carpentry through online videos and library books, even if everything went perfectly with no unexpected disasters or cost overruns, she would need at least $80,000 in materials alone to make the Blackwood estate livable. She had $73 in her bank account after the purchase, and her 2 jobs brought in maybe $2,200 a month before taxes. The rational decision was obvious. Walk away. Let someone with actual resources take on the project. Except that some dreams were simply too big for people like her. But Sarah had made the bid anyway, and now she owned a mansion that her entire family believed would be her financial and emotional ruin. The courthouse clerk handed her a ring with 7 keys, each one labeled in Vernon Blackwood's shaky handwriting. Front door, back door, basement, attic, tower, carriage house, shed. Sarah clutched the keys like they were treasure rather than responsibility, feeling the cold metal press into her palm hard enough to leave marks. Her mother hadn't even attended the auction. The entire family had staged one final intervention 2 days ago, gathering in Patricia's spacious living room to explain in excruciating detail why Sarah's plan was insane. Her brother Thomas, who sold insurance and had opinions about everything, had actually brought printed spreadsheets showing projected costs versus Sarah's income, complete with graphs that illustrated what he called the inevitability of foreclosure. "You're going to lose everything," Thomas had said, tapping his color-coded charts with a pen like he was presenting evidence in court. "You'll default on the property taxes within 6 months. The county will seize it again. And then you'll have nothing to show for your $500 except the town's pity and our family's embarrassment." Patricia had tried a softer approach, sitting next to Sarah on the couch and taking her hand with the kind of gentle pressure usually reserved for delivering bad news. "Honey, I know the divorce was hard. I know you're trying to prove something to yourself. But this isn't the answer. You can't fix your life by destroying what little stability you have left." Even Sarah's mother had weighed in, her voice carrying disappointment so thick it felt like humidity. "Your father would be ashamed. We raised you to be practical, to make sensible choices. This mansion obsession is just grief and desperation dressed up as ambition." But Sarah had stopped listening somewhere around Thomas's 3rd spreadsheet, her attention drifting to the family photos covering Patricia's walls. Pictures of Patricia and Marcus's wedding. Their 2 children graduating college. Family vacations to beaches and mountains and theme parks. Every image showed a family that had followed the rules, made the sensible choices, built the stable life that was supposed to guarantee happiness. And Patricia was miserable. Sarah had lived with her sister during the first month after the divorce, and she'd heard Patricia crying in the master bathroom at 2 in the morning, sobbing into a towel while Marcus snored in their king-size bed. She'd seen the hidden bottles of wine that Patricia kept in the laundry room, emptied and replaced with a frequency that suggested something more than casual drinking. She'd watched Patricia apply makeup every morning with the precision of someone creating a mask rather than enhancing beauty. The sensible choices hadn't guaranteed happiness. They just guaranteed a different kind of prison. Sarah left the courthouse and drove her 13-year-old Honda toward the Blackwood Estate, following the winding road that climbed into the foothills where Maple Ridge's wealthiest families had built their homes during the timber boom. Most of those grand houses were gone now, replaced by modern developments or allowed to collapse into the earth. But Blackwood Estate still stood, stubborn and defiant, like an old soldier who refused to surrender even when the battle was obviously lost. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The mansion appeared through the trees like something from a Gothic novel, all turrets and gables and peeling paint that had once been deep burgundy but had faded to rust. The wraparound porch sagged in places, and several of the decorative spindles had broken free and lay scattered in the overgrown grass like fallen soldiers. But the bones were still good. Sarah could see it even through the decay, the strong timber frame and solid foundation that had held the structure upright through a century of mountain winters and summer storms. She parked in what had once been a circular driveway, now cracked and overrun with weeds, and sat in her car for a long moment, staring at the building she now legally owned. $500. The price of a used laptop or a week's groceries for a family of 4. The price of admission to a dream that everyone in her life believed would destroy her. Sarah grabbed her backpack full of cleaning supplies and tools, locked her car out of habit even though there was nobody around for miles, and walked up the front steps with her ring of keys. The front door was solid mahogany, 8 feet tall and 4 feet wide, with an oval window of beveled glass that caught the afternoon sunlight and threw rainbow patterns across the porch. The wood was weathered and the glass was cracked, but Sarah could imagine how it must have looked when Edmund Blackwood first built this place, when timber money was flowing and the future seemed unlimited. She tried 3 different keys before finding the right one, and the lock turned with a grinding sound that suggested nobody had oiled it in decades. The door swung inward on hinges that screamed like wounded animals, revealing an entrance hall that was somehow both magnificent and heartbreaking. The foyer was 2 stories tall with a grand staircase that curved upward toward the second floor, its banister hand-carved with designs of leaves and vines that must have taken months to complete. The floor was black and white marble in a checkerboard pattern, dirty and cracked but still intact after more than a century of use. A chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals so thick with dust that they no longer reflected light, just absorbed it like tiny black holes. Everything smelled of mildew and decay and time, that particular scent of abandonment that settles into buildings when humans stop caring for them. Sarah took a step inside and the floor creaked under her weight, a sound that echoed through empty rooms and up empty staircases, announcing her presence to a house that had been waiting for someone to care again. She spent the first hour just walking through rooms and taking inventory, her notebook filling with observations and measurements and priority lists. The kitchen was a disaster, with cabinets that had warped from water damage and linoleum that had peeled away from the floor and sheets. The dining room was better, with built-in china cabinets and wainscoting that just needed cleaning and minor repairs. The library made Sarah's heart ache with possibility, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves on 3 walls and a fireplace with a marble mantel carved with scenes from classical mythology. The living room, parlor, music room, conservatory, each space revealed layers of history and craftsmanship that modern builders had forgotten how to create. The second floor was worse. 6 bedrooms in various states of decay, 2 bathrooms with plumbing that hadn't worked in years, and a master suite that took up the entire east wing of the house. Vernon Blackwood had died in the master bedroom, and Sarah could still see the stains on the hardwood floor where his body had lain for 2 weeks before discovery. She'd known about this before making her bid, had researched the circumstances and steeled herself against the reality. But standing in the room where a lonely old man had died alone and undiscovered still made her chest tight with sadness. The third floor was the servants' quarters from when the Blackwood family had employed live-in help, 4 small bedrooms and a bathroom that was remarkably intact. And then there was the attic, accessible through a narrow staircase hidden behind a door that Sarah almost missed. The attic key was the smallest on the ring, and it took her several minutes to find the lock, disguised as a decorative carving in the door frame. The stairs were steep and narrow, clearly not meant for regular use, and they creaked so loudly under Sarah's weight that she worried they might collapse entirely. But they held, and Sarah emerged into an attic space that was far larger than she'd expected, running the entire length and width of the mansion with exposed beams and skylights that had been covered with boards. The air was thick with dust and heat, even in November, and Sarah's flashlight beam cut through darkness that seemed almost solid. Boxes and furniture filled the space, generations of Blackwood family possessions packed away and forgotten. Sarah spent an hour just exploring, opening boxes to find clothes from the 1920s, photograph albums showing people whose names had been lost to time, business records from the timber company that had made Edmund Blackwood wealthy and then destroyed him when the market crashed. And then, in the far corner of the attic behind a steamer trunk that must have weighed 200 pounds, Sarah found something that made her stop breathing. A safe. Not a small safe for documents or jewelry, but a massive floor safe built into the structure of the house itself, 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, with a combination lock that looked like it belonged in a bank vault. The metal was tarnished and dusty, but the craftsmanship was obvious even in the dim light. This wasn't something Vernon Blackwood had installed. This was original to the house, built when Edmund Blackwood first constructed the mansion in the 1890s. Sarah knelt in front of the safe and ran her fingers across the combination dial, feeling the precision engineering that still worked smoothly after more than a century. The safe door had a small brass plate engraved with a name she didn't recognize. Hartford Security Systems, San Francisco, 1895. She tried the handle, knowing it wouldn't open but unable to resist the impulse. The mechanism was locked solid, unmoved by her efforts. Sarah sat back on her heels and stared at the safe, her mind racing with possibilities and questions. What had Edmund Blackwood considered valuable enough to install a floor safe in his attic? Why had Vernon Blackwood, who'd lived in this house for decades, never mentioned it or accessed it? And most importantly, what was inside? Sarah pulled out her phone to take photos, but she had no signal this deep in the house and this far up the mountain. She made detailed notes instead, sketching the safe's dimensions and the combination dial's features, documenting everything with the thoroughness that had made her good at her job as a paralegal before the divorce had forced her to start over with diner work. The sun was setting by the time Sarah locked the mansion and drove back down the mountain toward Maple Ridge, her mind still circling around the image of that safe hidden in the attic corner. She hadn't told her family about the discovery, hadn't mentioned it to anyone. Something about the safe felt private, like a secret the house had shared with her specifically because she'd been willing to look beyond the obvious decay and see the possibility underneath. That night, Sarah lay in her mother's basement guest room, unable to sleep, her thoughts spinning between practical worries about restoration costs and wild fantasies about what might be locked in Edmund Blackwood's attic safe. Probably nothing, she told herself. Probably just old documents or family heirlooms that had sentimental value but no actual worth. But another part of her mind, the part that had made her bid $500 on a condemned mansion despite everyone's objections, whispered different possibilities. What if there was something valuable? What if Edmund Blackwood had hidden assets before the crash? What if the safe contained something that could help her restore the house and prove to her family that her crazy purchase had been inspired rather than insane? Sarah knew she was being ridiculous, letting desperation and hope override common sense. But as she finally drifted towards sleep, her last conscious thought was of that safe waiting in the darkness, holding secrets that nobody had disturbed in more than 90 years. Sarah spent the next 3 days researching antique safes with the obsessive focus of someone who'd stumbled onto a mystery that might actually matter. Between her morning shift at Miller's Diner and her evening shift answering complaint calls for the cable company, she haunted the Maple Ridge Public Library, scrolling through digitized newspaper archives and historical records that painted a picture of Edmund Blackwood's life that was far more complex than the simple timber baron narrative she'd heard growing up. Edmund hadn't just been wealthy. He'd been one of the richest men in the Pacific Northwest during the logging boom, controlling timber rights across 3 counties and employing over 200 men in his mills and logging camps. The newspapers from the 1890s showed him attending social functions in San Francisco, donating to museums and universities, hosting elaborate parties at the Blackwood Estate that attracted politicians and business leaders from across the country. But the articles also hinted at darker aspects of his empire. Labor disputes that turned violent. Accusations of bribing county officials. Whispers about business practices that destroyed smaller competitors through tactics that skirted the edges of legality. The market crash of 1929 had wiped Edmund out completely. Sarah found a heartbreaking article from November 1929 describing how Edmund had lost everything in a single week of trading disasters, his timber company stock becoming worthless, his assets seized by creditors, his reputation destroyed by accusations that he'd been cooking the books for years to hide mounting debts. He died 6 months later at age 62, officially from a heart attack, but everyone understood it had really been shame and financial ruin that killed him. The estate had passed to his son Robert, who'd tried unsuccessfully to revive the family fortune before losing the mansion to back taxes in 1947. But what fascinated Sarah most was a small detail in an article from 1928, a year before the crash. Edmund Blackwood had traveled to San Francisco in September of that year, supposedly on business, but the society pages noted he'd spent considerable time at the Bank of California and had been seen meeting with representatives from several mining operations. One gossip columnist had speculated that Edmund was diversifying his investments, perhaps moving assets into gold and precious metals to protect against stock market volatility. Sarah's hands had trembled as she photographed that article with her phone. Gold. The word seemed to glow on the screen like a promise or a curse, she couldn't tell which. She tried calculating what gold from 1928 might be worth today, but the numbers became so large they stopped feeling real. An ounce of gold in 1928 cost about $20. Today that same ounce was worth over $1,900. If Edmund had converted even a fraction of his timber fortune into gold before the crash, and if that gold was still sitting in the attic safe, then Sarah had bought a $500 mansion that might contain a fortune that could change everything. But she forced herself to stay rational, to remember that she was probably chasing fantasies born from desperation. The safe was more likely filled with worthless old documents or family jewelry that might fetch a few $1,000s at best. Getting her hopes up would only make the inevitable disappointment more crushing. Still, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the safe, couldn't stop imagining what it might mean if her wildest speculations turned out to be true. She started making lists during her breaks at work, calculating exactly what she'd do with real money if she somehow had it. Pay off her credit cards and the medical bills that had accumulated during the last year of her marriage. Buy the tools and materials needed to restore the Blackwood estate properly. Hire actual contractors for the specialized work she couldn't do herself. Create a small business fund so she could eventually quit her soul-crushing jobs and focus full-time on historical restoration work. Maybe even help Jessica, her best friend from high school who was drowning in student loans from her teaching degree and working part-time at Target just to afford rent an apartment share with 3 roommates. The dreams felt dangerous, like counting chickens before they hatched or tempting fate by assuming the universe owed her something good after everything that had gone wrong. But Sarah couldn't help herself. For the first time since Derek had asked for a divorce, she felt something other than despair and exhaustion. She felt possibility, even if that possibility was probably nothing more than elaborate self-delusion. On her 4th day of ownership, Sarah returned to the mansion with a proper toolkit borrowed from her neighbor and a determination to get inside that safe by any means necessary. She'd researched Hartford security systems and learned that the company had been one of the premier safe manufacturers of the late 19th century, known for combination locks that were virtually impossible to crack without the right code. But the research had also revealed that many Hartford safes from that era had been built with emergency access panels, hidden releases that allowed locksmiths to open them if the combination was lost. Finding such a panel would require careful examination of the safe's construction, looking for seams or catches that might indicate hidden mechanisms. Sarah spent 3 hours in the attic that afternoon, her flashlight beam revealing every detail of the safe's exterior while dust made her sneeze and sweat soak through her shirt despite the November chill. She traced every inch of the metal surface, pressing and prodding, looking for anything that might indicate a hidden release. The safe remained stubbornly locked, its 19th-century engineering still functioning perfectly after more than a century. Sarah was about to give up for the day when her fingers found something odd on the safe's left side, a small indentation in the metal that didn't match the rest of the surface. She pressed harder, and felt something give slightly, like a button or catch that had been designed to be invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Sarah grabbed a flathead screwdriver from her toolkit and carefully inserted it into the indentation, applying gentle pressure while turning slightly. There was a soft click, and suddenly a panel on the safe's side swung open, revealing a secondary lock mechanism that looked like it had been designed for a backup key rather than a combination. Sarah stared at the keyhole, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. She'd found the emergency access, but she didn't have the key. And finding a key that was probably lost or destroyed 90 years ago seemed just as impossible as cracking the original combination lock. She was about to close the panel in frustration when something caught her eye. Scratched into the metal beside the keyhole, so faint she'd almost missed it, were 3 letters. RBW. Robert Blackwood. Edmund's son. Sarah sat back and tried to think like someone in 1929 who'd just lost everything and needed to protect whatever assets remained. If Edmund had put gold or other valuables in this safe before the crash, he would have wanted his son to be able to access it eventually. But he also would have wanted to keep it hidden from creditors and bank officials who were seizing everything he owned. So he would have given Robert a key, or told him where to find one, some way to access the family's last remaining wealth when it was safe to do so. But Robert had never accessed the safe. The newspapers showed he'd struggled financially for years before losing the mansion entirely. Either he'd never known about the safe's contents, or he'd known but couldn't access it for some reason. Sarah began searching the attic more systematically, opening every box and trunk, examining every piece of furniture for hidden compartments or secret drawers. The Blackwood family had left behind mountains of possessions, and somewhere in this accumulated history might be the key to a safe that could change Sarah's entire life. She worked until darkness made searching impossible, then returned the next day and the day after that, methodically cataloging everything in the attic while looking for anything that might connect to those 3 letters. RBW. She found photographs of Robert Blackwood as a young man, handsome and confident in the way of someone who'd grown up wealthy and never imagined that wealth could disappear. She found his college diploma from Stanford, business records from his failed attempts to revive the timber company, even a journal from 1930 where Robert had written about his father's death with a mixture of grief and anger that felt raw even 90 years later. "Father died believing himself a failure," Robert had written in shaky handwriting. He could not bear the shame of losing everything, could not face the workers he'd employed and the creditors he'd failed. He took his secrets to the grave, and perhaps that is where they belong. Sarah read that passage 3 times, feeling the weight of Robert's words across the decades. Edmund had taken his secrets to the grave. Which meant Robert probably never knew what was in the attic safe, never learned whether his father had managed to protect any of the family fortune before the crash destroyed everything. The tragedy of it made Sarah's chest ache. A father and son separated by pride and shame, unable to communicate about the one thing that might have saved their family from ruin. She was packing up for the evening when her phone rang, Patricia's name appearing on the screen with the kind of timing that suggested family gossip networks were operating at peak efficiency. Sarah almost didn't answer, knowing what was coming, but family obligation and ingrained politeness made her thumb hit the accept button anyway. Patricia's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "Mom told me you've been spending entire days at that mansion instead of looking for a real job. Sarah, this is getting ridiculous. You bought a building that's literally falling apart, and now you're treating it like some kind of treasure hunt instead of facing reality." Sarah closed her eyes and counted to 5, a technique her therapist had taught her for managing confrontational conversations. "I am facing reality. I own a property that needs work, and I'm doing that work. The reality is that I made an investment, and I'm seeing it through. Investment, Patricia laughed, and the sound was sharp enough to cut. You spent $500 on a condemned building. That's not investment, that's delusion. And Mom says you've been asking her weird questions about Edmund Blackwood and old family records. What are you looking for up there? Sarah thought about telling her sister about the safe, about the research on gold prices and Hartford security systems and the scratched initials that might lead to a key. But she could already hear Patricia's response, the patronizing explanation about how fantasy and reality were different things, how Sarah needed to stop chasing impossible dreams and start accepting that life sometimes just meant survival rather than success. So Sarah just said, I'm researching the house's history. It helps with restoration planning. There was a long pause, and Sarah could practically hear her sister's frustration building like pressure in a closed system. Then Patricia said something that felt like a punch to the stomach. Derek called me yesterday. He's concerned about you. Sarah's grip on her phone tightened until her knuckles went white. He said what? He called to ask if you were okay, Patricia continued, her tone suggesting she thought Derek's concern was admirable rather than invasive. He heard through someone that you'd bought some kind of mansion, and he wanted to make sure you weren't having a breakdown. He still cares about you, Sarah. He's worried you're making decisions based on emotion rather than logic. The betrayal burned like acid in Sarah's throat. Derek, who'd left her for a woman almost 10 years younger. Derek, who'd fought to keep almost everything in the divorce. Derek, who'd taken the dog and the house and the life they'd built together. That Derek was now calling her family to express concern about her mental state, and Patricia was treating it like he was being kind instead of manipulative. I need to go, Sarah said, her voice flat and cold. I have work to do. Sarah wait, but Sarah ended the call and turned off her phone, unable to handle any more of her family's opinions about her choices. She sat in the darkening attic surrounded by boxes of other people's history and let herself feel the full weight of her isolation. Her family thought she was crazy. Her ex-husband was spreading gossip about her mental health. She was living in her mother's basement and working 2 jobs to afford a mansion that everyone believed would financially destroy her. And she was chasing a fantasy about a locked safe that probably contained nothing valuable, pinning her hopes on a treasure that existed only in her desperate imagination. Sarah had never felt more alone in her life. But she also realized something sitting there in the dust and darkness. She didn't care what they thought anymore. Patricia's perfect life was a performance maintained through wine and prescription anxiety medication. Her mother's approval had always been conditional on Sarah making choices that looked respectable from the outside. And Derek's concern was just another form of control, his way of staying relevant in her life even after he'd chosen to leave it. The only person whose opinion mattered was Sarah herself, and Sarah believed the Blackwood estate was worth fighting for, even if she couldn't articulate exactly why. She spent the weekend working on the mansion's first floor, cleaning decades of grime from windows and woodwork, making lists of repairs she could do herself and problems that would require professional help. The physical work was exhausting but satisfying in a way her jobs had never been. Every clean window and repaired door represented tangible progress, proof that effort could create visible change. On Sunday evening, Sarah was in the library removing water-damaged books from the built-in shelves when she noticed something odd about the fireplace mantel. The marble carving showed various scenes from classical mythology, gods and heroes in dramatic poses that were typical of Victorian decoration. But one section of the carving looked different, less weathered than the surrounding stone, as if it had been protected or accessed more recently. Sarah ran her fingers across the carving, pressing gently on different sections. Most of the stone was solid and immovable, but one small section near the right edge gave slightly under pressure, like a button or release mechanism. Sarah pressed harder, and heard a soft click as a small hidden compartment opened in the mantel's side, revealing a space about 6 inches deep and 4 inches wide. Inside the compartment was a small wooden box, its surface carved with the same initials she'd seen on the safe's emergency access panel. RBW. Sarah's hands shook as she lifted the box out and opened the hinged lid. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a brass key about 3 inches long with an ornate head and a complex blade that looked like it was designed for a very specific lock. And underneath the key was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age but still intact. Sarah carefully unfolded the paper and found herself reading words written in Edmund Blackwood's own hand, dated November 15, 1929, 2 weeks after the market crash that had destroyed him. "My dearest Robert," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone and you have found the key I left for you. I pray that you will forgive me for the secrets I kept and the pride that prevented me from speaking of these matters while I still drew breath. The safe in the attic contains what remains of our family's fortune, converted to gold before the crash destroyed everything else I built. There are 100 bars of gold, each weighing 1 kilogram, purchased in September of 1928 when I began to fear that the market bubble would burst. I was not clever enough to save everything, but I was wise enough to protect something for you and for the future generations of our family." Sarah stopped reading, her vision blurring as the words sank in. 100 kilograms of gold. She did the math automatically, her paralegal training making calculations even as her emotions spun out of control. 1 kilogram was about 35 ounces. 35 ounces times $1,900 per ounce times 100 bars. The numbers were so large they didn't feel real. $6.6 million. Maybe more depending on the current gold price and the purity of the bars. Sarah was holding a key to a fortune that could change everything, not just for her but for everyone she'd ever wanted to help. The letter continued, and Sarah forced herself to keep reading through tears that she hadn't realized were falling. "The combination to the main lock is your birth date, month and day and year, but I feared that creditors might learn of this and force you to open it. So I created the emergency access with this key, hidden where only someone who truly knows this house would think to look. Use this wealth wisely, my son. Invest it carefully and live without the arrogance that destroyed me. Remember that money is not success and that the measure of a man is how he treats those who can do nothing for him. I failed in many ways, but I hope that this final gift will provide you the security I could not maintain." The letter was signed with Edmund's full signature and dated the day before he died. Sarah sat on the library floor holding the key and letter, trying to process what she discovered. Edmund Blackwood had hidden millions of dollars in gold to protect it from creditors, then died before he could tell his son how to access it. And Robert had lost the mansion without ever knowing that his family's salvation was sitting in the attic the entire time, waiting behind a lock that could have been opened with a key hidden in a fireplace mantel he probably walked past 1,000 times. The tragedy was overwhelming, generations of potential prosperity lost because a father's pride had prevented him from communicating with his son. But Sarah also realized with growing clarity that this discovery was hers now, legally and morally. She'd bought the property and everything in it. The gold belonged to her. Sarah spent Monday morning calling in sick to both jobs, unable to focus on anything except the key in her pocket and the safe waiting in the attic. She drove to the mansion before sunrise, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her fingers cramped. Everything felt surreal, like she was living in someone else's story rather than her own life. The attic key worked perfectly in the safe's emergency access panel, turning smoothly despite decades of disuse. Sarah heard the internal mechanisms releasing, tumblers falling into place with soft clicks that seemed impossibly loud in the silent attic. She gripped the safe's handle and pulled, and the massive door swung open on hinges that moved with the precision of Swiss clockwork. Inside the safe, stacked in neat rows like books on a library shelf, were 100 gold bars, each one stamped with the mark of the San Francisco Mint and dated 1928. The bars were smaller than Sarah had imagined, each about the size of a thick paperback novel, but unimaginably heavy when she lifted one out. The gold gleamed even in the dim attic light, untarnished by time, still perfect after 93 years of darkness. Sarah sat surrounded by more wealth than she'd ever imagined possessing, and felt nothing like she'd expected. No joy, no excitement, just a strange sense of vertigo, like she'd stepped off a cliff and was waiting to find out if she could fly or if she'd simply fall. This was real. This was actually happening. Her $500 impulse purchase had just become the discovery of a lifetime. And she had absolutely no idea what to do next. Sarah sat in the attic for 3 hours before she could move, the gold bars surrounding her like witnesses to something she didn't fully understand yet. The sunlight through the boarded skylights had shifted from morning gray to afternoon gold, and dust particles floated in the beams like tiny stars in a universe that had suddenly expanded beyond anything she could comprehend. Her phone had 17 missed calls, mostly from Patricia but also from her mother and even Thomas, the family gossip network clearly operating in overdrive after she'd called in sick to both jobs on the same day. But Sarah couldn't bring herself to care about their concern or judgment or whatever mixture of the two was driving their attempts to reach her. She was thinking about Edmund Blackwood sitting in this same attic in 1929, carefully stacking gold bars in a safe while his empire collapsed around him. She was thinking about Robert spending years struggling financially while his salvation sat 20 feet above his head, separated from him only by his father's pride and inability to communicate. And she was thinking about herself, about the chain of seemingly random events that had led her to this moment. A divorce that destroyed her finances. A desperate auction bid that everyone called insane. A combination of curiosity and stubbornness that made her search when a sensible person would have walked away. Sarah finally stood, her legs stiff from sitting on hardwood for so long, and carefully closed the safe door. The gold wasn't going anywhere. It had waited 93 years already. It could wait while she figured out how to handle this discovery without destroying herself in the process. Because Sarah understood something that was making her chest tight with anxiety even as part of her wanted to celebrate. This gold represented more money than she'd ever imagined having, enough to solve every financial problem she'd ever faced. But it also represented complications and dangers she was completely unprepared to navigate. Questions about taxes and legal ownership and whether gold from 1928 could be sold without triggering investigations into how she'd acquired it. She drove down the mountain as the sun was setting, the key to the safe and Edmund's letter locked in her glove compartment like they were more valuable than the gold itself. Maybe they were. The letter proved provenance, showed the chain of ownership that might protect her from accusations of theft or fraud. But it also raised questions about whether the gold legally belonged to her or to some descendant of the Blackwood family who might have a claim on their ancestors' hidden wealth. Sarah's paralegal training, rusty as it was after 2 years of diner work and customer service, kicked in with a list of steps she needed to take. Find a lawyer who specialized in property law and estate settlements. Research precedents for found wealth on private property. Get the gold appraised by someone trustworthy who wouldn't immediately report the discovery to every news outlet in the state. Understand her tax obligations and legal exposure before doing anything that couldn't be undone. But before any of that, Sarah needed to tell someone, needed to share this discovery with a human being who might understand the magnitude of what had happened. Not her family. They'd proven they couldn't see past their own assumptions about her poor judgment and desperate circumstances. Not a stranger. The wrong person learning about millions in gold could turn Sarah's discovery into a target on her back. She needed someone who knew her well enough to understand why this mattered, who was smart enough to help her navigate the complications, and who was trustworthy enough to keep the secret until Sarah figured out her next move. Sarah drove to Jessica's apartment, the cramped 2-bedroom she shared with 3 other teachers in a building that smelled like old carpet and someone's perpetual dinner cooking. Jessica answered the door in sweatpants and an oversized Stanford sweatshirt, her hair in a messy bun, looking exhausted in the way that elementary school teachers always looked by November when the initial enthusiasm of the school year had worn off and summer vacation was still impossibly far away. Sarah walked in without saying anything and sat on Jessica's donated couch that had a spring poking through the left cushion, and just started laughing. Not happy laughter, but the slightly unhinged sound of someone whose reality had shifted so dramatically that normal emotional responses no longer applied. Jessica closed the door and sat next to her, concern written across her face in the way of someone who'd known Sarah since they were both 14 and could read her moods like weather patterns. "Okay, you're scaring me. What happened? Did your family do something? Did Derek do something? Should I be calling someone or getting a baseball bat?" Sarah shook her head and pulled Edmund's letter from her jacket pocket, unfolding it carefully and handing it to Jessica without explanation. She watched her friend read, saw Jessica's eyes widen as she got to the part about 100 bars of gold, saw her mouth form a silent O of disbelief when she reached Edmund's signature at the bottom. "This is real," Jessica said, and it wasn't quite a question but wasn't quite a statement either. "I found the safe this morning," Sarah replied. "The gold is real. All 100 bars. I held them. They're sitting in my attic right now, worth somewhere around $6 or $7 million depending on current market prices." Jessica set the letter down like it might explode, her hands shaking slightly. "Sarah. Oh my God. Sarah, I don't even know what this is. This is everything. This changes everything." "Does it though?" Sarah asked, and heard the fear in her own voice. "Because I don't know what to do with this. I don't know how to handle it without making mistakes that could cost me everything. What if there are legal claims on the gold? What if selling it triggers tax problems I can't afford? What if I make one wrong move and end up worse off than I was before I found it?" Jessica stared at her for a long moment, then said something that made Sarah want to cry from relief at being understood. "You're afraid this is going to be like winning the lottery. How it destroys people because they don't know how to handle sudden wealth. How everyone comes out of the woodwork wanting a piece. How the thing that's supposed to save you ends up ruining your life in different ways." Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. She'd been trying to articulate that exact fear since sitting in the attic surrounded by gold that should have felt like salvation but instead felt like responsibility so heavy it might crush her. Jessica took Sarah's hand and squeezed it with the same fierce loyalty that had carried them through high school breakups and college stress and Sarah's divorce. "Okay. Here's what we do. You don't tell anyone else yet. Not your family, not your ex, nobody. We find you a lawyer who specializes in this kind of thing, someone in the city who doesn't know you and doesn't have connections to Maple Ridge gossip networks. We research everything about found treasure and property law until we understand your rights and obligations. And we move slowly, carefully, making sure every step is legal and documented. You didn't do anything wrong. You bought a property and found something valuable on it. But we're going to protect you from people who might try to take advantage or claim you don't deserve this." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest, the first full breath she'd taken since opening the safe. "Thank you. I didn't know who else to tell. I know you have your own problems and your own financial stress, and I promise that when this is all figured out, when I know what I'm doing, I want to help you with your student loans." And Jessica cut her off with a look that was equal parts affection and exasperation. "Stop. We'll talk about that later if you want, but right now this isn't about me. This is about making sure my best friend doesn't get destroyed by something that should be amazing. So we're going to be smart and careful and we're going to figure this out together, okay?" "Okay," Sarah said, and meant it. They spent the next week moving with the kind of careful precision that Sarah remembered from her paralegal days. Jessica used her teacher connections to find a lawyer in Sacramento who specialized in estate law and had experience with unusual property discoveries. Attorney Michael Chen, no relation to the safe manufacturer, agreed to meet with Sarah under strict confidentiality agreements. His office was in a renovated warehouse downtown, all exposed brick and modern furniture that suggested success without ostentation. Michael was in his early 50s, with silver hair and glasses that made him look like someone who spent a lot of time reading complex legal documents, which according to his credentials he did. Sarah showed him Edmund's letter and photographs of the gold bars she'd taken with her phone, and watched his expression shift from professional interest to genuine surprise. "This is extraordinary," Michael said, setting down the letter carefully. "And legally, it's fairly straightforward in terms of ownership. You purchased the property and everything in it through a legitimate auction process. The gold was part of the estate assets, undiscovered until you found it. Under California property law, you have clear ownership. The complications will come in other areas." "Taxes," Sarah said, because she'd been researching obsessively and knew this was coming. Michael nodded. "You'll need to report the discovery and pay taxes on the fair market value. Capital gains if you sell the gold, potentially estate taxes depending on how the original purchase is classified. We're looking at roughly 40% of the total value going to various tax obligations if we structure this correctly. 40% of $6 million was still more than Sarah had ever imagined having. But Michael wasn't finished. There's also the question of publicity. A discovery like this will attract media attention. People claiming to be Blackwood descendants might emerge with legal challenges to your ownership. Your family and ex-husband will learn about the gold, which based on what you've told me could create personal complications. You need to be prepared for your life to become very public very quickly once this information comes out. Can I keep it secret? Sarah asked, knowing the answer but needing to hear it anyway. Michael shook his head gently. Not if you want to sell it legally. And I strongly advise against trying to sell gold of this quantity through unofficial channels. The risks far outweigh any benefit. My recommendation is that we document everything thoroughly, establish clear legal ownership through the courts, pay all applicable taxes, and then you decide what to do with what remains. You'll still be a wealthy woman, Sarah. You'll just be a wealthy woman who did everything correctly and can sleep at night knowing nobody can take this away from you. Sarah hired Michael on the spot, paying his retainer with money she borrowed from Jessica and promising to pay back 10 times over once the gold was officially hers. The legal process took 4 months, and they were the longest 4 months of Sarah's life. Michael filed petitions establishing Sarah's ownership and legal right to the discovered assets. Sarah paid for professional appraisal of the gold bars, which turned out to be worth slightly more than she'd calculated. $7.2 million at current market prices. She worked with accountants to calculate tax obligations and set up financial structures that would protect her wealth while ensuring full legal compliance. And through it all, Sarah kept working her 2 jobs and living in her mother's basement, terrified that if she changed anything about her life before the process was complete, some cosmic force would decide she didn't deserve this and take it all away. The secret couldn't hold forever. In March, 6 months after Sarah had found the safe, a clerk in the county recorder's office mentioned the unusual estate case to a friend who worked at the local newspaper. By the next morning, Sarah's discovery was front-page news in the Maple Ridge Gazette, complete with historical photographs of the Blackwood estate and speculation about the gold's total value. Sarah's phone started ringing before she'd finished reading the article, and didn't stop for 3 days. Patricia called first, her voice shaking with something between anger and disbelief. You found millions of dollars and didn't tell us? Your own family, Sarah, and we had to learn about it from the newspaper? Sarah had prepared for this conversation with Jessica's help, had practiced staying calm and setting boundaries. I didn't tell anyone until the legal process was complete because I needed to protect the discovery. This isn't about trust or family, it's about being careful with something important. Her mother called next, crying, asking how Sarah could have kept such a secret when the family could have helped and supported her. Thomas called to offer financial advice that Sarah politely declined. Even Derek called, his voice carrying false warmth that made Sarah's skin crawl, congratulating her on her good fortune and suggesting they should meet for coffee to catch up. Sarah declined that too, with more satisfaction than was probably healthy. But the most unexpected call came from a law firm in San Francisco representing someone named Vernon Blackwood, who claimed to be Robert Blackwood's granddaughter and wanted to discuss the gold's ownership. Sarah's stomach had dropped when Michael told her about the legal challenge, all her fears about losing the discovery coming back in a rush. But Michael had smiled, that calm smile of someone who'd anticipated this exact scenario. Robert died without children. His sister Margaret had one daughter who died in the 1980s with no descendants. We've already researched the entire Blackwood family tree. This Catherine is probably a distant cousin at best, and she has absolutely no legal claim to property that was sold legitimately at auction. Don't worry. This is just someone trying to take advantage of publicity. We'll handle it. The legal challenge was dismissed within a week, the judge ruling that Sarah's ownership was clear and that no Blackwood descendant had any claim to assets discovered on property they'd lost decades ago through failure to pay taxes. Sarah paid her tax obligations in April, a check so large it made her hands shake when she signed it. But even after taxes and legal fees and accountant costs, Sarah had $4.3 million. Enough money to change everything about her life, to solve every problem that had seemed insurmountable 6 months ago. She paid off her credit cards and medical bills, wrote checks that felt like closing chapters of pain and stress. She paid back Jessica's loan with $20,000 extra for student loans, ignoring her friends' protests. She bought a reliable car to replace her dying Honda. And then Sarah did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She moved into the Blackwood Estate and started the restoration work she'd originally planned, but now with actual resources instead of desperate hope. The mansion's restoration took 2 years and cost $800,000, a fortune by any normal measure but a fraction of what Sarah now possessed. She hired contractors for the major structural work but did much of the finish carpentry and decoration herself, learning skills through online courses and the kind of hands-on experimentation that came from having enough money to make mistakes without destroying yourself financially. The Blackwood Estate slowly transformed from abandoned wreck to something that honored both its history and its future, Victorian elegance meeting modern livability in ways that preserved the craftsmanship while making the space functional for contemporary life. Sarah opened the mansion as a museum and event space in the 3rd year after her discovery, dedicating rooms to the history of the timber industry and the Blackwood family's rise and fall. Edmund's letter was displayed in a climate-controlled case in the library, alongside photographs and documents that told the story of how pride and inability to communicate had cost a father and son everything. The safe itself remained in the attic, empty now but preserved as part of the historical tour. Sarah hired staff from Maple Ridge, including 2 of Jessica's former students who needed jobs after college, and watched the mansion become something living again, filled with visitors and events and the kind of community connection that made history feel relevant rather than dead. Her family's relationship with Sarah shifted in ways both subtle and profound. Patricia stopped offering unwanted advice and started asking genuine questions about Sarah's work and plans. Her mother admitted, during a rare moment of vulnerability, that she'd been wrong to doubt Sarah's judgment and that sometimes the least sensible-looking choices turned out to be the most important. Thomas still offered financial advice, but now with respect for someone who'd proven she understood risk and reward better than his spreadsheets ever had. Derek never called again after the news of the legal victory, and Sarah found she didn't miss his presence at all. But the most significant change was internal, something Sarah felt every morning when she woke up in the restored master bedroom where Vernon Blackwood had died alone. She'd been afraid that room would carry sadness or death, but instead it felt peaceful, like the house had forgiven itself for past neglect and was grateful for the care Sarah had poured into its restoration. She'd taken Edmund's advice from the letter to heart, investing her remaining wealth carefully and living without the arrogance that had destroyed him. She donated to local schools and libraries, established a scholarship fund for Maple Ridge students studying history or preservation, and worked with historical societies to document other at-risk properties before they were lost to time and neglect. Sarah's life had become something she never could have imagined during those dark months after the divorce. Not just financially secure but purposeful, connected to community and history in ways that made every day feel meaningful rather than a mere survival. The gold had changed everything, but not in the way she'd feared during that first terrifying day in the attic. It hadn't destroyed her or made her a target or turned her family relationships toxic beyond repair. Instead, it had given her the resources to become who she'd always had the potential to be, someone who could take a broken thing and make it beautiful again, who could honor the past while building something new. On the 5-year anniversary of buying the Blackwood Estate, Sarah stood on the restored wraparound porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, the same color as the bars that had changed her life. Jessica was inside setting up for a fundraiser event, teachers and community members gathering to celebrate the scholarship fund that had sent 12 Maple Ridge students to college. The mansion glowed with light and voices, alive in ways it hadn't been since before the Great Depression destroyed Edmund Blackwood's empire. Sarah thought about the chain of events that had led her here, how her lowest moment, sitting in that cramped apartment contemplating $500 she couldn't afford, had actually been the beginning of something extraordinary. How the family who'd mocked her purchase now gathered in the home she'd saved, enjoying the beauty she'd preserved. How the worthless inheritance had proven to be priceless in ways that went far beyond the gold's market value. The land didn't always give back what it took. Edmund Blackwood had learned that the hard way, watching his timber empire collapse while he had gold that his pride prevented him from sharing with his son. But sometimes, if you were stubborn enough and curious enough and willing to dig beneath the surface when everyone else had given up, the land revealed secrets that had been waiting for exactly the right person to find them. Sarah wasn't that person because she was special or deserving or chosen by fate. She was that person because she'd been desperate enough to take a risk that looked insane, and because she'd had the courage to keep searching when the sensible choice would have been to walk away. The Victorian mansion stood solid behind her, its bones as strong as they'd been 130 years ago, its purpose renewed by someone who'd refused to accept that beauty and history should be abandoned just because restoration seemed impossible. Sarah Mitchell had bought a condemned building for $500, and in return had found not just gold but something far more valuable. Proof that sometimes the things everyone else calls worthless are actually treasures waiting for someone brave enough to believe in possibilities that exist beneath the surface, hidden in attics and sealed behind locks that open only for those who refuse to give up on finding answers to questions nobody else thought to ask. 10 years after Sarah Mitchell bought a condemned mansion for $500, the Blackwood Estate had become something nobody in Maple Ridge could have predicted. Not a monument to one woman's extraordinary luck, but a living testament to what happened when someone refused to accept that broken things had to stay broken. The mansion hosted over 15,000 visitors annually, people coming from across the country to tour the rooms where timber money had built an empire and market crashes had destroyed it, to see the attic safe that had held a fortune through 93 years of silence, to walk through spaces that proved history wasn't just something that happened to other people in other times. Sarah was 44 now, her hair showing the first threads of silver that she didn't bother to hide, her hands marked with calluses from restoration work that had become her life's calling rather than a single project. The Blackwood Estate had been just the beginning. In the years since the gold discovery, Sarah had purchased and restored 6 other historical properties throughout the region, buildings that had been abandoned or condemned, written off as too expensive to save. Each restoration had taught her something new about craftsmanship and patience and the particular satisfaction that came from bringing beauty back to places everyone else had given up on. But the Blackwood Estate remained special, the place where everything had changed and where Sarah still lived in the master bedroom she'd once been afraid would carry nothing but sadness. The room looked different now, filled with furniture she'd chosen herself and photographs documenting the mansion's transformation from ruin to renewal. But Sarah had kept one thing exactly as she'd found it, Edmund Blackwood's letter in its climate-controlled case downstairs, the words that had changed her life preserved for future generations to read and consider. The scholarship fund named after Edmund and Robert Blackwood had sent 47 students to college, young people from Maple Ridge who might not have had opportunities without financial help. Some had gone into teaching like Jessica, who now served as the fund's director while maintaining her position at the elementary school. Others had studied engineering, medicine, law, history, spreading out across the country but carrying with them the knowledge that their education had been funded by a tragedy turned into opportunity, a father's hidden gold transformed into chances for people who hadn't even been born when Edmund died believing himself a failure. Sarah's relationship with her family had settled into something comfortable if not quite close. Patricia visited occasionally, her marriage slightly better after she'd finally agreed to counseling that addressed problems she'd been hiding behind wine and performance. They talked about real things now instead of Patricia offering advice and Sarah politely declining, actual conversations where both sisters acknowledged that life was complicated and that nobody really had all the answers. Sarah's mother had moved into a retirement community in Sacramento, her health declining but her pride in Sarah's accomplishments genuine even if she still didn't quite understand how the daughter who'd lived in her basement had become someone featured in architectural magazines and historical preservation journals. Thomas had tried to involve himself in Sarah's financial planning until Sarah had gently but firmly established boundaries, explaining that she had professionals handling her investments and that family relationships worked better when they weren't mixed with business advice. He'd been hurt initially but had eventually accepted that Sarah's success meant she didn't need his spreadsheets or his opinions about risk management. Derek had faded into irrelevance, remarried and moved to Arizona according to mutual friends, his dental practice thriving and his concern about Sarah's mental health apparently resolved once it became clear she was wealthier and more successful than he'd ever been. The legal aftermath of the gold discovery had been complex but ultimately straightforward. Several more distant Blackwood relatives had emerged claiming ownership rights, but Michelchin had methodically disproven each claim, establishing that Sarah's purchase of the property had been legitimate and that no descendant had any legal standing to challenge assets found on property they'd lost decades earlier. The IRS had audited Sarah's tax returns twice, both times concluding that she'd properly reported income and paid all obligations. The gold itself had been sold gradually over 3 years through reputable dealers, converted into investments that generated income while preserving capital for future projects and charitable work. But what Sarah valued most wasn't the money or the recognition or even the satisfaction of proving her family wrong about the mansion purchase. It was the quiet moments when she walked through the restored rooms and felt the weight of history surrounding her like a presence that was watching and approving. Edmund Blackwood had built something beautiful, then lost it to forces beyond his control. His pride and inability to communicate had cost his son everything, a tragedy that had rippled through generations. But Sarah had broken that cycle, had turned the Blackwood estate into something that honored the past while serving the present, that acknowledged failure while celebrating resilience. The museum exhibits told the complete story without romanticizing either the wealth or the loss. Visitors learned about the timber industry's environmental destruction alongside its economic importance, about the workers who'd been injured or killed in logging camps while Edmund built his fortune, about the families destroyed by the Great Depression and the ways that wealth and poverty were often determined more by timing and luck than by virtue or hard work. Sarah had insisted on that complexity, had refused to let the Blackwood estate become a simple rags to riches tale that ignored uncomfortable truths about how fortunes were made and lost. On warm afternoons, Sarah often sat on the wraparound porch that had been rebuilt with wood reclaimed from one of Edmund's original logging camps, watching visitors explore the grounds and feeling connected to something larger than herself. The 4 acres surrounding the mansion had been transformed into gardens that mixed Victorian formality with native plants, creating spaces that were both beautiful and ecologically responsible. A small orchard occupied what had once been the carriage house location, apple and pear trees that produced fruit for local food banks. The collapsed outbuildings had been rebuilt as workshop spaces where Sarah taught preservation techniques to volunteers and students, passing on knowledge that would outlive her. Jessica visited most evenings after school, the 2 friends sitting together in the library where Sarah had found the key that changed everything, talking about their days and making plans for the scholarship fund's expansion. Jessica had never married, her career and students filling her life with purpose that didn't require romance or children. They were family in the way that mattered most, chosen rather than obligated, connected by decades of friendship that had survived every challenge and change. One evening in late October, almost exactly 10 years after the auction that had started everything, Jessica brought up something they'd discussed before but never resolved. "You know you're going to have to ride a will eventually. Decide what happens to all of this after you're gone." Sarah had been avoiding this conversation because thinking about her own death felt like tempting fate, like the universe might decide she'd had enough good fortune and take it all back. But Jessica was right. The Blackwood estate and Sarah's other properties needed futures beyond her lifetime, plans that would ensure they continued serving the purposes she'd worked so hard to establish. "I've been thinking about that," Sarah admitted. "I want the mansion to become a permanent historical site, with endowment funding to maintain it even if visitor income drops. The other properties should be sold to preservation organizations or individuals who'll commit to maintaining their historical integrity. And the scholarship fund needs to be structured so it can operate in perpetuity, helping students for generations after we're both gone." Jessica nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You're building a legacy. Not just buildings, but impact that will last long after your name is forgotten by everyone except historians reading old records." The thought should have been depressing, acknowledgement of mortality and impermanence, but instead Sarah found it comforting. She'd spent so many years feeling invisible and powerless, watching her marriage dissolve and her financial security evaporate, believing that her life would never amount to more than survival. The gold had changed her circumstances, but the real transformation had been internal, the realization that she had agency and capability and the right to take up space in the world rather than apologizing for her existence. The Blackwood estate had taught Sarah that endings and beginnings were often the same thing, that what looked like failure could contain seeds of future success if someone was willing to dig beneath the surface and find what others had missed. Edmund Blackwood had died believing himself ruined, never knowing that his final desperate attempt to protect his family's future would eventually help dozens of students and preserve historical treasures that might otherwise have been lost. Robert had struggled and failed, losing everything including knowledge of the salvation sitting above his head. But their story hadn't ended with those failures. It had continued through Sarah's stubborn refusal to accept that a $500 mansion was actually worthless. Over the years, Sarah had received hundreds of letters from visitors who'd toured the Blackwood estate and been inspired by the story of the gold discovery and restoration. Some were from people facing their own financial disasters, thanking her for proving that catastrophic loss didn't have to mean permanent defeat. Others were from historians and preservationists who appreciated her commitment to telling complete stories that included uncomfortable truths alongside celebration of achievement. Several were from descendants of timber workers who'd labored in Edmund's logging camps, grateful that the museum acknowledged their ancestors' contributions and sacrifices rather than focusing solely on the wealth of the men who'd owned the companies. But the letter that had affected Sarah most deeply had come from a woman in Oregon whose grandmother had been one of Vernon Blackwood's few friends during his final isolated years. The grandmother had occasionally visited Vernon, bringing groceries and checking on his welfare, and had known about his declining health and increasing reclusiveness. She'd been the one who'd eventually called social services when Vernon stopped answering his door, the person whose concern had led to discovery of his death and the eventual auction that put the property into Sarah's hands. The granddaughter wrote that her grandmother had died 2 years after Vernon, never knowing that her kindness and concern had been part of a chain of events that would ultimately preserve the Blackwood legacy and create opportunities for students who needed help. She would have been so happy to know that checking on a lonely old man led to something beautiful, the letter had concluded. Sometimes the smallest acts of care create ripples we never get to see. Sarah had framed that letter and hung it in her bedroom, a reminder that significance often came from unexpected sources and that every choice, no matter how minor it seemed, was part of larger patterns that connected past and future in ways nobody could fully predict or control. She'd gone to the auction planning to spend $500 on a desperate gamble, and somehow that decision had created scholarships and preserved history and proved that one person's determination could matter even when everyone else was certain she was making a terrible mistake. The mansion's role in the community had evolved beyond what Sarah had originally planned. In addition to being a museum and event space, the Blackwood estate had become a gathering place for town meetings and charitable fundraisers, a venue where Maple Ridge came together to discuss shared concerns and celebrate achievements. The library hosted book clubs and historical lectures. The dining room was used for community dinners that brought together people who might not otherwise connect across economic and social divisions. The gardens provided settings for weddings and memorial services, celebrations of beginning and ending that tied individual lives to the larger story of the land and the people who'd shaped it. Sarah had learned that restoration wasn't just about buildings and historical artifacts. It was about community connection and shared memory, about creating spaces where people could understand their own stories as part of larger narratives that stretched backward through time and forward into futures they wouldn't live to see. The Blackwood estate had become a living argument that the past mattered not because it was perfect or inspiring, but because it was real and because understanding it helped people make better choices about present and future. As autumn deepened and winter approached, Sarah walked through the mansion's rooms thinking about cycles and seasons and the ways that everything eventually returned to the earth that had produced it. The timber that built this house had come from forests that no longer existed, cut down by men who couldn't imagine that the trees would ever run out. Edmund's wealth had been extracted from natural resources and human labor, built on systems that destroyed as they created. But the mansion itself had survived, adapted, found new purposes that honored history while serving present needs. The land around it was healing, native plants returning and wildlife populations recovering from decades of neglect. Sarah understood now that she hadn't saved the Blackwood estate. The mansion had saved her, giving her purpose and direction when she'd been lost and hopeless, providing the vehicle through which desperate circumstances could transform into meaningful work. The gold had been important, had provided resources that made everything else possible, but the real treasure had been the choice to care about something beyond her own immediate survival, to invest effort and hope into preserving beauty that existed before her and would continue after she was gone. On the 10-year anniversary of the auction, Sarah hosted a celebration that brought together everyone who'd been part of the mansion's restoration journey. Contractors who'd rebuilt the roof and foundation, volunteers who'd helped with gardens and exhibits, students who'd received scholarships, community members who'd attended events and supported the preservation work. Jessica gave a speech about how one person's vision could change an entire town's relationship with its history, how Sarah had proved that caring about the past wasn't nostalgia but responsibility. Patricia stood up unexpectedly and talked about how her sister had taught their family that conventional wisdom wasn't always wise, that sometimes the crazy idea turned out to be the one that mattered most. Sarah listened to these speeches feeling grateful and slightly overwhelmed, still not entirely comfortable with public recognition even after years of learning to accept it. When it was her turn to speak, she kept it brief, thanking everyone who'd believed in the project and acknowledging everyone who doubted it, because the doubters had been right to point out how unlikely success had seemed and wrong only in believing that unlikely meant impossible. "I bought this mansion thinking it might save me from poverty," Sarah said to the crowd gathered in the entrance hall where she'd first stepped through the door with her ring of keys and her desperate hope. "What I learned was that salvation doesn't come from money or luck or even from finding gold in attics. It comes from choosing to care about something beyond yourself, from believing that broken things can be made beautiful again if someone is willing to do the work." The evening ended with music and dancing, the mansion filled with light and voices and the kind of joy that came from celebrating not individual achievement but collective effort and shared commitment to preserving what mattered. Sarah stood on the porch as guests departed, watching car lights wind down the mountain road, thinking about Vernon Blackwood who'd stood in similar positions watching similar lights from parties that celebrated wealth that would soon disappear. But this celebration was different, built on foundations more solid than timber money or gold hidden in safes, based on work that would continue long after Sarah was gone because it served purposes larger than any individual's fortune or failure. The night air smelled like autumn leaves and wood smoke from the fireplaces Sarah had restored to working condition, sense that connected present to past in ways that felt like continuity rather than loss. The mansion would stand through seasons Sarah wouldn't see, through decades that would bring changes she couldn't imagine, maintained by endowments and organizations she'd established to ensure that future generations could learn from the Blackwood story and understand that history was never just about the past but always about how people chose to honor or ignore or learn from what came before. Sarah went inside and climbed the grand staircase to her bedroom, the same route Vernon Blackwood had taken for his final years and Edmund had taken during the height of his power, the same stairs that had witnessed triumph and tragedy and everything between. The mansion settled around her with the particular creaks and sighs of old buildings at night, sounds that were familiar now rather than frightening, the house breathing in its sleep like something alive and content. Through her window, Sarah could see the lights of Maple Ridge scattered across the valley below, a town that had watched her buy a condemned building and had predicted her failure, that now pointed to the Blackwood Estate as proof that restoration was possible and that caring about history created value beyond any financial calculation. Sarah thought about the letter she'd found in the fireplace mantel, Edmund's final words to a son who never received them, wisdom that had skipped a generation but had ultimately found someone who could use it to create something lasting and good. She thought about the chain of unlikely events that had brought her to this moment, each seemingly random occurrence connecting to others in patterns that only made sense in retrospect, when you could see how divorce and bankruptcy and desperate auction bids had somehow combined to create opportunity from disaster. The land had given back what it had taken, but on its own timeline and in its own way, through mechanisms that couldn't be predicted or controlled. Sarah had learned to trust that timing, to believe that effort and care would eventually be rewarded even when immediate circumstances looked hopeless. She'd learned that legacy wasn't something you inherited from ancestors but something you created through choices about what to preserve and what to let go, about how to honor the past while building futures that served people who weren't born yet and might never know your name. As Sarah turned off the light and settled into sleep, her last conscious thought was gratitude. Not just for the gold or the mansion or the financial security that had replaced poverty, but for the journey itself, for the lessons that only came through struggle and the wisdom that only came through surviving things you thought might destroy you. The Blackwood Estate had taught her that nothing was ever really worthless if someone cared enough to look beneath the surface and find the value that others had missed. That sometimes the best investments were the ones that looked crazy to everyone else. That broken things could be made beautiful again if you were patient and stubborn and willing to do the work that restoration required. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.